The Dreamland Theatre in Edmonton, Alberta. A shabby little building out to make a buck. They worked hard in the Dreamland, but they didn't have too much to show for it at the end of the day. The afternoon of July 21st, 1896. 1,000 seats have been set up in the West End Park in Ottawa. When darkness falls, history of sorts will be made here. The Holland brothers of Ottawa, who among other things acted as agents for Mr. Thomas Edison, had decided to try out Mr. Edison's new Vitascope device, which projected moving pictures onto a screen. The Holland brothers were not too optimistic, but by 8 p.m. the seats were filled. The show opened with Belsaz the Magician, who performed some other tricks and then introduced the movies to Canada. They proved to be an unexpected hit. This was the feature of the evening, a movie called The Kiss, shown here in its entirety. For a while, the movies were just a part of a vaudeville show, but it soon became evident that you didn't need live entertainment. People would pay money just to see movies. So a barber shop in Calgary became the Palace Theatre. A dry goods store in Edmonton became the Bijou.
See, when movies started, people took little stores and they converted them. In the early days, they even, the theater owner didn't have enough money for seats, and he would borrow the seats from the undertaker down the road, down the street. And if there was a funeral, he was out of luck. He couldn't operate.
The early movies consisted mostly of scenery. Billy Bitzer, who went on to shoot Birth of a Nation, filmed the Fraser River Valley in 1899. The movie consisted of one shot taken from the front of a train. Royalty was another favorite subject. The Prince of Wales' visit to Quebec in 1903 played in theaters all over the world. A Toronto portrait photographer, George Scott, bought a movie camera and filmed one of the first on-the-spot newsreels, the Toronto Fire of 1904. Canadian companies sensed very early the potential of film. In 1902, the CPR hired this British company to make movies which would reassure potential immigrants that Canada indeed existed. They were under strict instruction to avoid any shots of ice or snow. But they obviously ignored this directive and made the Canadian winter seem like so much fun that the CPR decided to advertise it. This is the first hockey game ever filmed, a feature of the Montreal Winter Carnival of 1903. This is the old Tuque Blue Snowshoe Club of Montreal, working up a thirst for the tavern on the other side of the mountain. The man being tossed in the air is the cameraman, Joseph Rosenthal. He was typical of the early Canadian filmmakers. They were either British or American, and came to Canada on assignment. The Great Northern and Grand Trunk Railways, seeing that the CPR had a good thing going, began to make movies for themselves. When Ernest Ouimet of Montreal filmed his children in 1908, Canada had its first home movie. Mr. Ouimet, with his general manager, Fred Howarth, was the first Canadian to construct a building expressly for the movies. His first Ouimetoscope went up in 1903, and by 1906, business was good enough for a larger theater. The second Ouimetoscope became Canada's first motion picture palace. With Edwin S. Porter's Great Train Robbery, made in 1903, the story film came into being, and the audience was no longer satisfied with the simple travelogue. The CPR continued to display a sophisticated understanding of the power of the new medium. The railway hired the Edison Stock Company of New York to make 10-minute dramatic films that would promote the glories of the Canadian. Then it was 1914, and Canada was at war. Canadian cameramen were shooting newsreels and propaganda films to support the imperial war effort. The Americans were not yet in the war, and anti-American sentiment was running high. Film censorship was born, and the first things censored in Canada were scenes which featured the American flag. Canadian recruiting films were welcomed by theaters and governments until the troops actually went over to fight. By 1916, the Canadian Department of the Militia was demanding that newsreel footage from the Western Front be suppressed for fear it might discourage recruiting. Another politician was making a more positive contribution to the cinema. He was W. W. Hearst, Premier of Ontario. Back in 1917, Mr. Hearst had established one of the first government film agencies in the world, the Ontario Government Motion Picture Bureau. This was one of their first films, and their subsequent efforts were in the same vein. The product was aimed largely at the education and enlightenment of the Ontario farmer. The Bureau soon expanded and took over the bankrupt Trenton Studios. In the meantime, the federal government in Ottawa had also set up a motion picture bureau. It was aimed at encouraging tourism and attracting industry. The tree was heavily featured in early Canadian documentaries, and the Canadian cameraman became the world's leading expert on the photographing of wood and wood products. Another Canadian specialty of the 20s was the nature film. Canadian cameramen went to great lengths to properly capture the wildlife of the Dominion. Another art form of the silent cinema was the writing of cute little title cards to brighten up the films. Perhaps the best of the nature cameramen was the intrepid Bill Oliver of Calgary, who did most of his work for the National Parks Department. Oliver would do almost anything to get his shot. Scaling cliffs, building towers, or digging pits in the path of a herd of buffalo. Oliver did much to make the Canadian naturalist Grey Owl internationally famous. His movies on the English beaver expert who posed as an Indian were seen all over the world.